Welcome to another Gaslec podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and I'm the owner of Gaslec, and I'll be running through this episode with you. This week's episode's all going to be on for our DIY friends out there that are doing a little bit of plumbing for themselves and some little hints and tips on where we see things go wrong and where you can make some improvements. And if you want to do it yourself, how to get that professional finish without it costing you a tradesperson like ourselves to come along to get it done. But first of all, here's my friend Sean to tell you a little bit about the podcast and why we do it. Thank you for listening to another Gaslec podcast, the show to help DIYers, new people into the industry, and those who are wanting to expand their knowledge. Each week we'll pick a topic and go into details, and with special guests and listeners' questions answered, we will look forward to some of the conversations. So let's get back to the show. Right, and thank you very much indeed for listening where you ever are in the world. I know we've got some American listeners, so some of this stuff here might be a little bit different for you guys. We don't have building codes and we have building regulations. But yeah, you have like licensed plumbers. We don't tend to have that in here in the UK. You can be a qualified plumber, but so you've been through the educational city and guilds typically sort of channel, or you can be an unqualified plumber. So you can still do the same things. It's just if it goes wrong, obviously from an insurance point of view, will you be covered? So that's the question mark with it there, really. When you start looking at playing with gas and stuff like that, you don't have a choice here in the UK. You've got to be gas registered, and that's probably exactly the same in the US for their systems over there. But anyway, so we're just talking about stuff in the UK. So if you are listening abroad, just this is how we do it over this side of the pond on the little tiny island. So first thing we see a lot of is compression joints, couplings, elbows, T's, that sort of stuff, and using PTFE tape. So we see this a lot where someone puts the nut on first, puts the olive on, offers it up to the joint, then wraps PTFE tape around the thread over the olive, then up a little bit, snaps it off, then winds the nut back, and then you see the PTFE tape sticking out the back of the nut on the compression. Now, this has got a Teflon sort of non-stick coating to it, the PTFE tape. I can't exactly remember what P, T, F and E stand for, but the T is for Teflon. So this does give it a little bit like lubrication. So when you're pulling the nut up, it will slip round quite nicely, but it's not a jointing method that we do on the professional side of things. So if you have issues with sort of like over tightening, I'll go through that in a minute on over tightening, then you can get repetitive leaks, and you'll see some people wrap PTFE tape around, but realistically there's no real place for it anymore, PTFE tape. Wrapping it around threads and compression olives. The compression olive is designed to be the right size to fit inside the right, the right taper of the thread. So it doesn't need any other bulking out, because that's what basically PTFE does, bulks out. So you don't need to do that on any of the joints. And we use like a jointing paste. So there's a company called like V2. Not sure if that's the make or the the product name, but it's just like a non-setting paste. It's quite thin. Sometimes it comes a little brush in the lid. People like Screwfix, B&Q, Toolstation, they all sell it in one form or another, and you just slip it round and then just nip it up, and that gives you the little bit of reduced friction when you're doing up between the copper nut and the brass nut and the copper olive, and when you're pulling up. And it can get a little bit squeaky, so you put a little bit of that on. That just pulls it. I mean, it doesn't set; it stays moist. It doesn't dry out really. It does eventually. Goes a little bit hard and brittle, but that's a long time. But the idea is it's got like oil in it. But yeah, so you just nip it up, and it's fine, and it's water safe as well. So if a bit does go inside the pipe, as it inevitably will do, and it comes through the cold water main, and you do have a little bit to drink, then it is safe to consume. It's not ideal. You wouldn't start scooping out the tub and start wafting it in, but if you do come across it, it's not dangerous to your health. So yeah, PTFE tape. So we were using it up to a few years ago onto radiator tails. So on radiators, they have like a 1/2 inch female thread on the bottom, and then you wind in your little tail that goes in, a little 1/2 inch male, and that winds in and gives you a little stalk, and then the compression nut of the radiator valve goes on top of that. So what then people were doing was wrapping PTFE tape around there and then winding it in, and we had quite a high failure rate, and I think across the industry it did as well. You had to get it just right as it was cutting through, because that's basically what it was doing. As you're winding it was cutting, and it'll create almost like a little seal on the end, and then you end up getting callbacks for those. And then we started using Loctite 55, which is like a same sort of thing, but it's like a threaded, like a string almost, very, very tough. And you wind that into the thread and lock that in. But these days we use liquid PTFE. So I think it's Everyday Tools we come across a couple of years ago, and we haven't really gone back since. We do have certainly for the larger threads. You sort of like your inch, quarters, inch and a half, 2 inch and upwards, that sort of stuff. You will use a hemp paste onto that, but certainly on the sort of 1/2 inch and 3/4, we just use the threaded lock, and it's just like a Loctite, so it'll go into the thread and it will just glue the thread up, and you bottom it out if you can, nice and tight, and just leave it 5-10 minutes, and that's it. The thing sets. If you do ever have to release it, get a blow lamp, put a little bit of heat, warm it up. That's its sort of kryptonite, really, heat, and then heat it up, and then that'll just crack off, and you'll see it's all hard, and you'll be able to get a little brush on it and take the excess off. But if you're ever using the liquid PTFE, the joint must be completely dry. You can't use it if there's a little bit of water in the radiator and you're winding it in. If you've got to do that, bit of Loctite 55, and then wrap that round and go back to sort of the plan B, as it were, or so PTFE, Loctite, and then plan C being the liquid. So you have to go back. But another thing also with the PTFE is when people wind them into radiator tails, because it is an exposed thread that's coming out of the radiator. If you have a look, if you put too much PTFE tape on it, it really does stress that thread, and it starts opening it up, and they start cracking and splitting. So you've got to be really, really careful not to put too much on. Too little and it'll leak. Too much and it'll damage it and it'll crack. So just on PTFE tape there, really. The next one is over tightening compression joints and crushing the olives. Now, this is a bit of a difficult one because there's no real torque settings out there how tight you do a compression olive. Now, what I would say is, as I've discussed when I was about using a PTFE tape, offer your pipe up, put a little bit of paste around the olive, push it all together, nip it up. Now, I use, say, 10-inch adjustable spanner and a set of grips. So I hold the fitting with the grips, and I'll do it up. But my hand is almost touching the head of the spanner, as the actual jaws as it's coming round, and I'll just give that a firm nip up. Really, but I'm not right at the end of the shaft of the spanner, so I'm quite low down as I give it a little pull, and then obviously do your testing. So it really is a bit of you feel it and you get a bit of a feel for it. When you go from like 15 mil and you go up to 22, you need a bit more pressure to do those, and if you go up to 28, a bit more, 35. That's when you start getting the Stilsons out, because it starts getting a bit too much just for an adjustable spanner to nip them up. And then you go up to 42, then you definitely need Stilsons, 2 sets, just to get the leverage on that nut. But certainly when you're looking at your DIY stuff, you're looking at 15 and 22. You can do that off a set of 10 inches, to be honest, as long as the jaws go wide enough for those. So, and if you get to a point where you're over crushing it and it's still leaking, and you're nipping it up and it's still leaking, you may have gone too far and crushed the olive. And then once you take it all apart, and you'll see the olive, and you'll feel like a groove. So sometimes we have a tool to cut olives in 1522, and it's like a little guillotine, and you just put it over, squeeze it, and a little bar comes out with a little like a bladed edge. That cuts the olive in its vertical, and then that splits it open. And if you feel a ridge on that copper pipe after you've taken that olive off, that's it. That you've got to cut that pipe and then rejoin it and then bring it through. That over crushed piece of pipe and olive, that's absolutely finished. So what you should be able to do is release the joint, get a set of pliers on the olive, and then wiggle it, and it should just pop off on its own. and you can slide a new olive on there to make it and start again on it. If you can't slide it off, it's a good chance it's over tightened, and you've got to start again. And that's where people start putting PTFE tape on and stuff. But it's finished. The actual jointing method has collapsed. It's over. It can't do any more than that. So bin it off. Another thing we see is basin wastes. So there's two types of waste on a basin. So if you've got an overflow on a basin, you'll have what's called a slotted waste. So the overflow water goes out the back of the basin and goes round the outer skin and then falls through into the trap. So when you look at your waste, the little chromy bit typically that goes through the bottom, it'll have two little slots on the side, and they line up with the overflow from the inner skin of the basin. And we see a lot of, not so much it leaking round the top part, but leaking from underneath where a seal's not been made up properly, because you're not just dealing with the water coming from the top of the basin and then coming down the thread, because that's normally quite easy to seal, i.e. with a bit of like a silicone, or if it's a bit wet, use CT1 because that's a slightly different material. It's a bit more expensive, but that's like you get out of jail material, the CT1. Because that'll work with water, underwater, so toilet systems and that sort of thing. If you're putting them back together, you don't use silicone, use CT1. But when you're putting those in, it'll seal quite nicely, but if it then goes up through the overflow and it comes down, it comes round the outside past that seal, and then will then try and drop in. Inevitably, it will sit around the outside the thread underneath the basin where the big plastic nut or the brass nut and the washer comes up to. So it's really important to get that seal nicely there and not over tightened. Some of these cheaper wastes, they come with like plastic sort of like washers that push up underneath. And if you over tighten them, they start stretching and deforming all out of place. So you really got to have a look and make sure that it's not all getting deformed. And if you are using silicone on a brand new dry piece, make sure it's set quite well. Give it a good hour. Make sure it's gone off before you start testing it as it comes through. Now there is a bit of an old fashion method, so using something called plumber's mate, which is like an oil-based material. It's quite thick. You roll it into a bit of a sausage, and then you wrap it round the waste and you push it down. You sort of just trim off the excess with a little bit of a knife and then clear it up from there. When we have sanitary ware, which is made of like china, we call it, like a ceramic. What these are just made in bulk in China, typically in the place, and then they're cast and they're fired. So realistically, there's never two actually the same, a bit like a brick really, because of the very nature. So they all look the same, but if you could actually take some accurate measurements, they're all a little bit wonky and all a little bit donkey, and there's if you run your hands across them, you normally feel little imperfections and bumps. That's because they're not made to a very, very high standard. So that means the waste hole that goes through won't be flat. It'll have a bit of a bump in it. It'll be a little bit elliptical. It won't be perfectly round. But your waste fitting as it comes through will be, because its metal has been engineered. So then having the silicone or the plumber's mate will take up those imperfections and undulations in the material, and it'll pull down nicely. Very similar to toilet spigots. So the back of the toilet where the waste comes out, we call that the spigot. So when we fit the pan connector onto the back, if you actually look at those tubes, little sort of 3.5 inch, 4 inch pipes that come out the back, when you actually look at those, they're never completely round. They're not a perfect shape. But the rubber seal of the pan connector will take up, and that's why it's always important to use good quality ones like McAlpine here in the UK, rather than a Flowplast or something along those sort of lines, because you'll only give you trouble. And certainly if you're doing it for a job, you'll get a callback, and who pays for the callbacks? We do. So use the right materials, charge the customer properly, do it right first time. You don't get a callback, they ain't paying for the material anyway. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Everyone runs around. Love it. So I've just got on here about a plan B. So whenever we're doing even myself, I was out, where was I the other day? I was working late in a small commercial premises after hours on Friday. So I got called up, and it was in a children's nursery, and they're knocking through this wall, and there's basically some radiator pipes that were there, and now they're a trip hazard, so we can't expect the kids to jump over them, and now until eternity. So we had to then reroute them. So I took the pressure out of the heating system, and we'd run the pipes round another way and capped them off on one end. So that was easy. Anyway, so I had to cut into the existing heating pipe. So I was like, right, okay, put the drain on. Yes, okay, that leg's drained off. I'm happy with that. But you always go through a what if. What if? So when I first started cutting the pipes, there was a young lad there. He was helping this other builder guy. And I said to him, oh, guess what? I've got these big set of grips here, and I had like a plastic box. And as I was cutting the pipes, I was just catching the drips in there. I was really, really confident, but I couldn't see all of the pipe. It went into a box in, through a wall, and then popped out the other side. So there was always that 1% of doubt is this pipe empty? And I had my set of grips there. And I said to him, why have I got these here? He said, I don't know. I said, because if this isn't, I'm going to squeeze that copper pipe very, very quickly and bend it over, because I need a plan B. And I had my towel there, and it turned out absolutely fine. It was heating pipes, and there was no dramas. But always have a plan B. Always have a rubble bag ready, because rubble bags don't have holes in, unlike carrier bags. So you get a brand new one of those and rim it out and just roll it up, and then have that ready. You can catch quite a lot of water in a rubble bag if it's going wrong. And having a way of, if I have to isolate water, do I have to crimp the pipe? I'm running my pipe slicer and it starts going. How can I sort of, a bit of damage limitation? What about a wet vac? What happens if there's just a little slug of water, and as soon as I cut it, it's going to let the air in, it'll glug out. So you might only have maybe a pint or two of water coming out. So maybe not a huge amount of water, but how are you going to manage that without it going all over the floor or the customer's carpet? Certainly if you're working on the first floor, it will find a hole, it will get through, and it will then start staining the ceiling below. And if you're really, really unlucky, like I was once, I dropped a small amount of water. It must have been, what was I doing? I think I was pre-charging an expansion vessel in a small commercial. And I dropped some water. It must have been about half a cup of water. So it wasn't a lot in this little mini plant room on the first floor, but there was a gap in the floor, and directly below that was the smoke alarm sensor. And water went into it, and that's it. Beep, 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 beep. Whole place ended up evacuating because this small amount of water landed perfectly in the head of the smoke alarm. So, I had to undo it, dry it all out, reset the panel, get it all back up, test it. Yes, we're all happy days here. But yeah, I think they call that Murphy's Law rather than Sod's Law these days. But always have a plan B. So there we are. So 18 minutes into this podcast. So I don't like doing podcasts that are too long. So it's just a couple of bits there for the your DIYers out there listening. And if you're new into the industry, sort of take on board these little bits and pieces, and they will make sense a little bit longer. So as you go through your career, these little bits and pieces, these little hints and tips will start coming a bit more obvious to you. So once again, thank you very much indeed for listening, wherever you are in the country or wherever you are in the world. So please carry on listening. And if you've got any comments, leave them on the platforms. I'm not quite sure how to get them off, or just send them to podcast@gaslec.net. If you send an email in, if you've got any questions at all, you want to be on the show, give us a shout and we'll get it arranged. Thank you very much indeed, guys. Have a fantastic week. Take care. Goodbye.